It sounds like you do have a stake in the race, and you actually think that the DEI policies are stupid and bad and wrong. Isn't it the case, though, that you don't want the government to be able to come to that determination? You flat out do not want the government to be engaged in what you think private employers should be allowed to engage in.
I think my issue with the government is I just don't think that the government is generally very efficient in making these decisions. Therefore, it should be scaled back a bit.
Why is it so toxic to push what you are at least saying is likely a coherent concept?
Actually, I think defending trans rights on this basis is easier than going to people who have like locked in positions about the definition of woman and trying to get them to like get rid of everything they think they know, get them to just agree that I can like wear the kind of clothes I want. That's much easier.
I have a stronger position on it in the sense that I think when conservatives say you can't force this definition on us, I think that they're delusional. Hey folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description.
Boom. Amazing. How are you?
Hello. I'm doing good. I was checking out your YouTube channel and stuff.
Oh God.
I feel like
Why?
you are killing it. It's impressive.
Listen,
you're getting like good views.
I
on
appreciate
stuff.
that. Listen, you don't have to flatter me. We're here to interview you and see what you're doing, what you're up to. So, but I do really appreciate that. And no, it's so great to have you on. The last time we spoke, we actually had a conversation about this article that you wrote. And I would love to talk to you about that and some other situations, what's going on, how you're experiencing the Trump administration. Both, I don't want it to just be like necessarily give me the trans take or whatever, but in general, just to get your take on those issues, but also other issues and your thoughts on it. But I want to start with the article, if that's okay with you, and just have like a conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so background
context.
is that you helped me on the article.
Oh, that's
I reached out
great.
to you because I was like, I need a lawyer's perspective. There was like a part of the article where I was talking about civil rights law and making a legal argument, which obviously I'm not a lawyer or someone with a law background. So it was helpful to have, I don't know, someone just to like sanity check it and be like, you know, am I making like some super dumb argument?
No,
that kind of thing.
I appreciate that. And I want to preface this by saying, listen, your article has a very provocative title. And I think that it's a very provocative article. It's thought provoking. And I'm not going to say that it's, that I necessarily agree with every part of it. But I do think that I'm appreciate that you took the time to get like a litigator's perspective on because some of the issues that you deal with explicitly reference some fee shifting provisions and some incentives of corporations and with respect to litigation, and that is something that I think it's helpful to have a lawyer's perspective on. And so I appreciated you reaching out, and I'm so happy to see that it was actually published. And it took me a little bit. This was actually published in February, and it took me basically when the Supreme Court decision came down, Scrimeti, I think it's called, about and I don't know if you're familiar. I'm sure you were
just a tiny amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I was like, wait a second. Didn't Taft send me an article? And I was like, oh shit, I never read that. And so I went back and read it, and I'm like, it would be really nice to have you on to talk about it. So that's the background here. But before that, why don't you, if you'd like to, give a background on yourself a little bit, and then what I'll give the title of the article. The article is called, quote, "The Progressive Betrayal of Trans Americans. How Well-Intentioned Laws Created New Cultural Conflicts," is the subtitle, "and eroded personal liberty." So definitely a provocative title to, I would say, the left, a challenge to the progressive movement a little bit. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, however much you're comfortable with, and then what inspired you to write the article?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I saw someone in your chat right before I went on. They said, Taftaj sucks, actually, not gonna lie. And you were mad at them, but I think they may have just been referencing my former career as an OnlyFans creator, posting, sexy videos and stuff.
That's
So
funny.
maybe totally not, I think, ill-intentioned on that person's part.
Oh, you think that they're making a reference to the sexual?
Yeah, I think it
okay.
was just they're being very literal with their
Yeah, sure.
description.
That's is that the good way to interpret that, or is that belittling?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't care. I think it's I used to post OnlyFans photos. So I did like sexy photos. I mean, like, frankly, I'm making a joke here because I never really did stuff that was that risque. It was mostly like lewds. So I'd get in like I don't know, swimsuits or lingerie and that sort of stuff. And developed like quite a, I don't know, following on that, and used that to like reach out to various political people and argue to like get me on their streams. And I don't know, I did a whole thing where I was talking with Destiny, and I've spoken with Richard Hanania, and you mentioned my girl, Brianna Wu. I did a podcast with her. So I've like made this circuit online, but never really, I don't know, done my own podcast or my own YouTube channel. Yeah. I like dipped my toe into it very briefly. So I've kind of had like a bit of a distance from it. I guess that's all to say that I'm kind of I'm speaking euphemistically here. I've also been very controversial online for having lots of, I think, anti-progressive or like anti-left-wing takes. So I've been like pretty critical of progressive trans activism in general. And I did not write the title to the article, but yeah, I think that's pretty standard. I think a lot of times, you know, if you get an article published, whoever publishes it will choose the title for you. But the article that I had originally suggested, I think was even more controversial. I think it was just something like progressives have betrayed trans Americans or something like that. And maybe they might have even like played with a few different titles, because I feel like at one time the title was how trans people are not being served by the right or the left or something like that. So yeah, when I wrote the article, I was writing, imagining like a progressive person reading it. So I think the arguments that I make in that are pretty like cautious to the progressive side. At least that's my impression. As soon as it got published, a lot of
that you had the left wing in mind actually when you wrote it. That you weren't just being a pick me. You were actually hoping to appeal, perhaps, and you know, give an argument. It was published in Reason, right? So that would appeal to the left
Libertarian magazine.
Yeah, obviously. But what I'm going to say is that you were trying to give a rational argument that might appeal not just to you know, to right-wing reactionaries, and it is about liberty or how you conceive liberty. And so yeah, no, that's it's good to note that at least your intention isn't just to provoke for its own sake.
No, I mean, I think I'm kind of a lib or a progressive at heart, like fundamentally. And one of the reasons why I know that is because whenever progressives critique me, it feels like painful. I'm like, oh, guys, like, why are you critiquing me? Like, I will like want to impress them. And whenever right-wingers critique me, I'm kind of like, whatever. So yeah, I don't know. Despite all my blustering, I think maybe I'm secretly still obsessed with the libs.
Yes, secretly a lib. I put the article in the chat here for you guys if you want to see it for the Twitch and YouTube chat. So definitely check it out. And so you mentioned a little bit that your background is something of, I'm not going to say a contrarian because it's a bad word, but you don't fit into necessarily the orthodoxy of what people expect, perhaps, of a young left-wing, or at least associated with a left-wing trans person. Can you speak a little bit more about that before we get into the article? In what ways do you think that your views are unorthodox, or I should say people might consider them to be more right-wing or more centrist on some of these issues? From a general perspective, we don't need to get into the weeds because we'll talk about it more specifically in the article.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever heard of Jonathan Haidt and his like moral foundations theory?
I have not heard of the moral foundation theory from Jonathan Haidt. No.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, I may even be like misquoting the exact name for it, but his idea is that you can categorize people politically based on fundamental moral values. And so there are things like sanctity or freedom or authority or care/harm. And so liberals, you give them tests on these moral axioms and moral axes, and they will score really high on care versus harm. So they really care about that. They also care about liberty, and they also care about like fairness. But it's like really centered in care versus harm. Libertarians, they tend to score really highly on like the freedom dimension, almost like nowhere on the other dimensions. And then conservatives kind of tend to be equal across the board. And I think that in some fundamental way, my moral axes, the things that I value just arbitrarily, are kind of at odds with the progressive worldview. So I think I tend to be pretty interested in like order and freedom and fairness. Um, and it's like a little bit, it's like, I think probably most similar to libertarians. But even then it's kind of distinct. So I just have like a very, I think, unusual moral framework, which sets me at odds with a lot of people. And I think back when I was like debating on Twitch poll, I think I got marketed a lot of times as like a conservative trans person, which is probably like a bit of
the test is if you were
yeah.
invited as part of the balance of the right wing on these shows where they try to balance it. But no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, but I was, yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I was like very much like billed as like a conservative trans person. I think to some extent that was kind of me like knowing that if I wanted to get invited on shows, it was like pretty easy for me to like take this route and, you know, throw in conservative arguments, and, you know, get lots of airtime through that. But the other part of it was, I think I've always been genuinely quite interested in sort of unusual right-wing thinkers. So people like Peter Thiel or Curtis Yarvin, people in the kind of like dissident reactionary space who, you know, they're probably pretty high openness to ideas. They'll hang out with transsexuals. I won't say a slur here. They'll hang out with transsexuals and they will explore really provocative ideas. But ultimately, they're like, I saw them as kind of like open to a more transpositive view. And so I was kind of like marrying that perspective with a trans one, which obviously is unusual.
Yeah,
Not something you find
I
on the
appreciate
internet.
that. And people have already sort of gotten, you know, some of the signals already I'm seeing in the chat. And I'm sure the Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel stuff will trigger a lot of people in the chat 100%, as it triggers me.
No, they're welcome to be.
Yeah, 100%. And trust me, I didn't bring you on thinking that we're just going to necessarily agree on everything or that you are going to like that everyone in the audience is going to agree with you. I brought you on because I think it's an interesting, you provide an interesting perspective that I want to know more about. So let me set the scene a little bit here. And I'll give you my thoughts when I read the title of your article. Who the f*** is this person talking about the progressive betrayal of trans Americans? Doesn't she know blah, 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 what's going on with the Trump administration, this and that? And then I read it one more time, and then, you know, I didn't obviously know that you didn't choose the title. I am aware that sometimes people, you know, editors will choose the titles for you. But even just framing it that way, you know, as an indicative of what the article is going to say, I'm like initially rolling my eyes and angry, but then the word kind of comes out to me, betrayal, right? Betrayal implies, right, like just like a traitor implies some duty, some level of obligation that existed beforehand, right? Like you don't betray someone that you were always oppositional to. You know, you would never say, for example, conservatives, national Christian conservatives who've always been against trans people, betrayed the trans community. You know, so implied in the notion of a betrayal, in being a traitor, is some allegiance that existed beforehand. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to hear Taf out because I should not be just triggered by the word betrayal and then not read the article. And when really this could be a critique on how we can help trans Americans, and really, I'm not hearing that like just the notion of betrayal. It doesn't necessarily imply that the worst kinds of abuses to the trans community are coming from the side that betrayed. But talk me through the initial inspiration of writing this article, and give a brief synopsis on what your message is in, you know, a few sentences.
I'm trying to organize my thoughts a little bit so I can
take your
be
time.
succinct
No.
here. First, I think it's a frustration with the style of activism that progressives engage in. I feel like it's deeply counterproductive to protecting trans people. I felt like there was a better way, which is to focus on fundamental freedoms, so bodily autonomy and freedom of expression, I think are more robust ways to defend trans people. And two,
You said,
I wanted
sorry,
to be
sorry to interrupt you right there. You said
yeah.
more robust ways than what?
Oh, okay. So we'll get into this in the broader conversation. But I think that the current tact that is taken by trans activists is to really focus on the care harm piece. So, and to focus on sort of philosophical definitions about womanhood. So, classic arguments might be trans women are women in some sort of metaphysical sense, and therefore they ought to be able to, you know, present how they want or take hormones. They ought to be able to enter women's spaces. They ought to be able to participate on women's sports teams because they're women. Or alternatively, trans people are benefited psychologically by taking hormones. And so we ought to allow them to do that in terms of a kind of utilitarian pleasure maximizing sense. And I think both of those arguments are a little bit dicey for reasons that I talk about in the article. And I think that there's a lot more potential for making inroads with the average American voter by instead centering the argument on freedom. So making arguments like people ought to have the freedom to wear the kind of clothes that they want, and therefore trans people should be able to dress how they want, or people should have the freedom to do with their bodies what they will. So they should be able to alter it cosmetically, and therefore trans people should be allowed to engage in these cosmetic changes. And I go into like reasons, examples of, I think, average Americans, even like very conservative Americans, being sort of ambivalent on things like radical plastic surgery. So yeah, I want to leave that kind of for later, but that's the gist.
100%. Sure. No, and I want to just make sure I understand here. What I'm hearing is the argument from liberty, as opposed to the argument, for example, from utility, or the argument from this metaphysical, you might say, I don't know the right term here. The root that,
argument about definitions.
Yeah, definitions. That it's preferable to ground out in an argument from liberty, understanding always the difficulty in defining the scope of that liberty. When you say you prefer those arguments, or those are better arguments, if you say those, in what respect do you mean on like another meta level? Do you mean they're, because you cited they're kind of like the average American, how they would perceive it. Is this strictly, in some sense, from a meta perspective, utilitarian in the sense that this is the argument you think will appeal to most people? This is the argument that most resonates with you. This is the argument that's true. So in any or all of those combined. So just in what sense are you saying that argument is better? And then we'll get into specifics of the article, and I'll read some passages from it.
Yeah, that's a fun question. I think, yes, I think it's effective politically or strategically. So I think that even if you're a progressive or a lib person and you really are deeply persuaded by these arguments from utility or from metaphysical identity, I think you should still be open to engaging in these sorts of arguments from liberty as a kind of political strategy. But I also think on a deeper level, there's something about arguing from liberty that it doesn't rely on having the power to like control people. That's so vague. But what I mean is, like, if you're a progressive and you create like a, maybe you're in sort of like Rawlsian framework land and you're trying to like imagine a political system that you want to live in. And you create a political system where people can gain power and then implement their specific moral preferences. Then I think you end up in a situation where, a Democrat gets elected and for 4 years they enforce their moral preferences and trans people are doing good. And then a Republican gets elected and then the pendulum swings, then suddenly trans people are screwed. I think that's maybe not such a good world for trans people, and it's a sort of like unsustainable world long term. So I think there's maybe a reason why we should prefer a world that protects liberty at a more like base level and allows both of these groups to kind of enforce their moral preferences within communities that are voluntary. That way, you know, whoever's sort of in power, you have this fundamental protection of liberty. I think that's sustainable. And then trans people can sort of choose to live in the communities voluntarily that protect their rights. So that's sort of high level and probably demands 100 more pages, but I'm sure you.
I definitely appreciate the high level stuff here. So there is aspects of what you're saying that are absolutely instrumental in the sense that instrumental, outcome oriented, but it also is kind of feeding into your broader philosophical position vis-a-vis libertarianism and a focus on choosing your own community, choosing your own place to be. Okay. Okay. Got it. And thank you very much for the raid, guys. I'm turning off sound effects. I'm turning off sound effects so that we don't mess up the conversation. Okay, so I'm going to read first the introduction here from what you said, and let's get into some specific. You say the following, quote, "Transgender Americans like me are trapped in a grim paradox. Our progressive champions may have introduced notions of birthing persons to corporate America, but they have done little to safeguard our fundamental right to bodily autonomy. They have done little, that is to the progressive champions. As legislative threats from Republicans escalate, those same progressive champions stand to benefit undeservedly from a style of civil rights advocacy that unwittingly takes hostage a minority group that feels increasingly desperate for protection." So on the one hand, you are here, and tell me if you disagree, acknowledging the angst and the danger that trans people are feeling as a result of Republican activism, Republican, legislative threats, legislative attacks. But at the same time, you are sort of taking umbrage or taking a shot at these progressive champions. I think even just including the term birthing person here, you're kind of introducing it to ridicule it as a kind of token benefit, as a kind of something that is not truly valuable as opposed to the fundamental right to bodily autonomy. So I guess my question is, can you speak a little bit more about that grim paradox? Is the paradox that the people who supposedly are most in favor of your rights are failing, or talk with me a little bit through that?
I think there's a perverse incentive here. Quite frankly, I think the incentives across the board are kind of misaligned when it comes to trans advocacy. But what I'm pointing at is the fact that trans people are increasingly under threat from Republicans plays well for Democrats. So that becomes a rallying cry. And that's, trans people are all the more incentivized to vote for Democrats in that kind of political paradigm where we're being attacked by Republicans. But at the same time, the tactics that are being used by progressives and Democrats are, I think, not really helping us. And so, I give the example of birthing person, which is basically, I think that Democrats have really focused on the language and sort of policing how people talk about these issues and engage with them. And they're doing this kind of across the board, I think, through civil rights law, such that, people who are working in steel mills in Indiana are getting this kind of language policing. And, it may or may not be helping them, but at minimum, it's kind of reaching people who it's not really benefiting. It's kind of turning a lot of people off from the broader trans movement. So I'm not sure how much it's helping us versus actually just kind of annoying people. I'd much rather Democrats focus on protecting more fundamental things. So yeah, I think that what I'm getting at there is just like a frustration with Democrats who are making all of these pushes in areas which are probably they work well. If you live in San Francisco, everyone around you agrees with them. But if you live in Texas, like I do, you hear about these things and it seems like they just turn everyone against you right from the get-go. You walk into conversations with them and they have a sort of idea about what a trans person is and what a trans person advocates for. And it's all based on this kind of high-level democratic messaging, which really does a disservice to individual trans people in red states. So, yeah.
So this is so one aspect of your critique here is specifically on Democrat messaging. One of the concrete things that you're critiquing is the way that Democrats are talking about the trans issue specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry, if you want to elaborate.
No.
Okay. Interesting. Do you? I guess I'll ask you some more probing questions. Do you view the Republicans and Trump specifically as the most acute threat to trans rights in America?
Yeah, I mean, I guess almost by definition, definitely more so than Democrats, and this seemed like the only other large option.
So the extent to which you are taking umbrage with the Democrats and with these progressive champions, it's not that they in themselves represent a malicious threat. In other words, you're kind of painting them as hapless or not thinking the way they ought to be thinking. But they're not the ones who are trying to infringe on your fundamental rights to bodily autonomy, correct? I mean, like, presumably, to the extent that they're not safeguarding your fundamental right to bodily autonomy, it's because your fundamental right to bodily autonomy is under threat by something, right? And by definition, that would be the other party, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Or maybe you could say like transphobes in the other party or something like that. But yeah.
Fair enough. I suppose it's not just exclusive to the Republican Party, but largely, at least in America.
I think so.
So that's, I guess before, and I do want to get into the specific because to paint a picture a little bit for the audience, it's not just messaging you have an issue with. You're also taking to task some civil rights frameworks, which have long been kind of the bread and butter of a lot of progressive movements, both on sex-related discrimination, race-related discrimination, stuff like that. But the kind of legislative framework, the burden shifting, the fee shifting framework that's used in all sorts of manners of progressive agendas. I'm thinking also of violations of other fundamental rights. And that is something, just to put a little caveat here, aspects of that echo in like the Abundance book by Ezra Klein and others, where they directly take to task some of the shifting on to the court system as the regulator. And so I do want to lay out that your article is more than just about the messaging and about the threat here, but talk to me about it, because you mentioned that Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin are people that maybe you align with philosophically or in some way. How can you, given that the underlying threat to your bodily autonomy is from Republicans who they've supported and championed and have been some sort of ideological bedrock for, if not Trump himself, at least J.D. Vance and some of the sort of intellectual people behind the Trump movement, which is a threat to you. So I'll let you answer that before we get to the kind of civil rights stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's kind of two parts of that question. I am addressing civil rights law as a regulation, and I think like all government regulation, the government can sometimes expand over time the scope of what it's trying to do, and it can do that inefficiently. And I think that there's no reason to think that this is sort of like impossible to happen around civil rights law. And in fact, I think there's probably good reason to think that the government is just not regulating civil rights law as effectively as it could be. And there's all sorts of gray area here, which is difficult for companies to navigate and creates costs and ultimately, does not effectively protect trans people. So that is kind of the fundamental argument. And I think that whenever you even like critique civil rights law at all, you get in kind of like murky waters where people get very frustrated with that, probably rightly so. But at the same time, I don't want to like come off as like a crazy person. I'm just saying that like I think that this could be done better, and the government is probably, you know, God bless their hearts. I mean, a lot of this law is like passed in like the 60s and 70s, and it's by people who could not have possibly imagined how it would be used in the future by all sorts of politically motivated entities. And so, you know, the law is just not equipped perfectly to deal with our modern considerations. But yeah,
go to the second part, and then I'll jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's your other question about like Peter Thiel or Curtis Yarvin. I mean, I can't like vouch for these people. So like to the extent that we disagree, we disagree. And I would never say that I like sign on 100% with something that Peter Thiel says or Yarvin says. I mean, like Yarvin says all sorts of absolutely ridiculous things. I think I read his book like ages ago, and he made some argument in it, which was like he didn't trust the narrative on climate change because his mom like worked with a Democrat politician who was really in favor of climate change regulation, and he was like a sleazeball. And that was kind of the extent of the argument. And I was like, what is he saying here? I thought it was totally ridiculous.
You're not co-signing everything that they stand for necessarily, is what you're getting at.
I couldn't possibly. But I mean, so I think that both Yarvin and Thiel, so like Thiel, he's a gay man. Yarvin hangs out with, you know, transsexuals. I think these are both people who don't have the same sort of like moral valence or, you know, positions as someone even like JD Vance, but certainly not someone like, you know, Mike Pence or part of the more evangelical right. So they really do represent a kind of libertarian position, which is maybe more like, you know, people can hack it in the free market, they can hack it, and that's awesome for them, and leave them to do what they will. So, you know, I think that to the extent that that's their position, I think that that's a version of right-wing philosophy, which I can get behind much easier than one that says that I'm sort of just like an aberration and, you know, should not be doing what I'm doing. Obviously, I could never hack it with that kind of political position.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. And so the libertarianism aspect now, I guess I doubt whether Yarvin's a libertarian. He seems, but let's put that aside for now, because I think that your article and you yourself are focused on rights and freedom to some extent, which obviously like libertarianism is, you know, a political philosophy about freedom. And I find it funny, you know, you talk about these different civil rights frameworks, which are aimed specifically at solving private discrimination. Specifically to help the audience, right? Like let's think about some of these civil rights frameworks. For example, there is a law that says that you are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to making hiring decisions for certain covered employers. And you could view that as a limitation on freedom, perhaps, right? Like, don't you have the freedom to be racist? Don't you have the freedom to hire whoever it is you want to hire? You know, it brings me back to, I don't know if you ever played the game BioShock or ever read Ayn Rand or anything, where like, is a man not entitled to the sweat of their brow? Are they not entitled to contract whoever they want to contract with? And so in some sense, right, some of these civil rights frameworks that we're talking about are specifically designed to give rights of actions in the case of private employers or private actors doing some kind of discriminatory act. So you could view that potentially as a some kind of limitation on freedom, but they were created at a time, you know, in the 1960s, let's say, or and a little bit before that and after, when there was a kind of bigger picture freedom that wasn't being fulfilled, sort of a larger scale freedom miss with respect to, I mean, what is it to be free as a Black American if you can't get a taxi, if you can't get a job, that kind of thing. So walk me through Then we'll talk about kind of the anachronism that you present in your article. But like, do you view these civil rights frameworks fundamentally as rights protecting in the sense that they're preventing some kind of unlawful or some kind of invidious discrimination, or do you view them as a kind of compromise on freedom for some utilitarian end or something else?
I do view them as a compromise on freedom for a utilitarian end. Um, I guess at this point too, I should probably make it clear that like I'm not one of these like radical ANCAP libertarian people who thinks that like there should be no restrictions on freedom. In fact, I think there's a good argument for exactly this kind of restriction on freedom, which is in a totally laissez-faire, like free system. There's another word for this, which is anarchy.
Yeah.
And in anarchy, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And it turns out that that is actually not so good for having like a functioning civilization. And
So you're not an ANCAP.
I think
So Fabian Liberty Scott didn't convert you.
no, not quite.
No.
He's fun to talk to, but no, I think fundamentally on a philosophical level, I think it's good if the government steps in to defend some of the weakest people in society. And in fact, I think that everyone benefits from it. So I think actually there's a collective action problem here, which is firms would prefer to exploit people, or if a firm can increase its profits by exploiting people, it'll do so. And if another firm is competing against, a competitor that is exploitative, then they're sort of forced to engage in the same exploitation to stay competitive. But you iterate that out through the whole system, and I think everyone ends up worse off because of the exploitation. We would rather people like negotiate like market equilibrium wages and stuff. We don't want the firm to like extract all of these profits.
Right. So for collective action problems, you identify that there can be a role in principle, potentially, as in a case by case basis, for intervention in the market by the government.
Exactly.
For example, in the case of minimum wages, where there's a collective, bargaining problem, potentially even in the anti-discrimination context. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And so I think that in civil rights law, it's doing exactly this. It's saying that there's this group in society that, if left to total own devices, they would not be able to advocate for themselves effectively. So the government has to sort of step in and protect them. That seems like, at the very least, like kind of like a bare minimum good thing. So yeah, I'm more libertarian on this than many people, certainly much more than like a Boyer, I'm guessing you. But at the same time, I do think that there's like a philosophical justification for this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think that your estimation is probably true, but it is good. I think that like sometimes it can be tough to, when you are unable to compromise on anything, then you really can't deal and you really can't onboard something like the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, by definition, would be anathema to you. So, stepping back a little bit, what we're talking about here, chat, because I'm seeing at least one person who's annoying the fuck out of me. Really, momentum, shut the fuck up. Is big picture, Taftaj is taking to task. Say that 5 times fast. Some of the progressives' attempts to solve the trans problem. The first things that she identified, as we talked about, is the messaging. And we touched a little bit on that. And now she's identified a second framework that the left has in history used to deal with this kind of discrimination, and specifically in the case of trans people, which are these anti-discrimination frameworks, these civil rights laws that put limitations on private discrimination and that enforce standards by the force of the government, by litigation, by private actors, or by government litigation, some standards on private actors. Okay, so that's the step back right now. And what Tat just made clear is, in general, she takes a more libertarian view, but it's not all encompassing. That she's willing to acknowledge that the government can sometimes be useful to solve market failures. Okay, so that's big picture. That this article is saying that the progressive champions have something wrong, and so far the two that we've talked about are messaging and civil rights frameworks that are definitely both parts of the progressive agenda and how they've dealt with these kinds of problems in the past. Okay, that's the overview. Got it? And
you're such a lawyer.
Yeah, no, sorry.
I love it.
Very structured thinker. So we're now taking a deep dive into the civil rights framework aspect of it, okay? And the civil rights framework about it is typically that there's a law that says, for example, it shall be unlawful to do X kind of private discrimination, and the government will be able to sue, or you will be able to sue. And I think what we'll talk about now is, first, let's deal with the potential anachronism or the potential misfit in the different kinds of discrimination. So you say in your article, you reference Superman, which is very topical right now because Superman is being used, and you couldn't have predicted this, that it would be such a political conversation because you wrote this article in February, but you talk about a quote from Superman, which is the following. The same year that Christine Jorgensen transition, this is someone that you talk about, like one of the first public transitions happened in 1952. And
a whole narrative going through the article, yeah.
Exactly. And at that time, this woman, Christine Jorgensen, there actually wasn't the organized level of opposition that there is now. Surely there were dissenting voices, but there was also like public support for it. And something you said, in the same year that she transitioned, this person, and it is woven in through the article, yes, a Superman poster illustrated the emerging idea of American duty. Quote, to talk about someone because of his religion, race, or national origin is un-American. And that's Superman saying that quote, that, to go after these immutable characteristics is un-American. What makes, and then you go on to say, what makes Superman a hero and not a tyrant, what justifies his exertion of force is this commitment. If such a poster were made today, you say, the cartoonist would probably add sex, sexuality, and gender identity to that list of protected tropes. But of course, right, these civil rights frameworks were made in the 1960s. So talk me through do you think that there's a misfit? Do you think that these civil rights frameworks that were created long ago, are they useful for private racial discrimination? And if they are, why are they not as useful for trans people?
Yeah. That's a good question. Hopefully I'm not going to answer this into too much of an abstract way. But because we've been talking about Peter Thiel, I think it's worth noting that this section was actually inspired by something that he says in the Straussian moment, where he identifies that the beginning of any political regime is some sort of act of murder, some crime. And it is in creating like the tomb for the dead that the first monuments are made. It is piling those stones on the deceased that one creates the pyramids. And likewise, throughout this article, I'm identifying how America relates to civil rights in a post-World War II era and the incredible shame that we felt when those Black Americans were coming back from World War II, and they had won victory over fascism abroad, but they had not won victory over racism at home.
And they were treated better in like UK and these other places where they were sometimes had host families, and as opposed to when they were home. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, exactly. And so we're getting, footage reels from concentration camps in Germany, and America's asking itself really big questions. Like, what is it that gives us the right to step into a new world as a global hegemon? What is our moral animus? And Superman is providing some of that moral animus. He's giving an answer to that question. What justifies taking power? What makes you not a tyrant? I think that one of the ways Americans answer that question is by saying that we care a lot about civil rights law. And so civil rights, I see it as the beginning of a kind of national mythology, a way in which we justify ourselves on the global stage and justify our power at home. So it's a deep discussion, and one which is very difficult to challenge effectively in the modern age. And I think it's because it's so difficult to challenge that we've ended up with all of this civil rights law over decades. So like, you know this, there have been multiple civil rights acts, and there have been multiple interpretations of those civil rights acts by the Supreme Court, which have added on to how we understand it and how we legislate it. And I think the result is that you have companies which are pretty scared of running afoul of civil rights law. And as a result, they're engaging in workplace control, which is, I think, probably not appropriate for the situation at hand. So
for both race
I'll give
and
you,
trans issues, or is it particularly pernicious with trans issues?
I think it's particularly pernicious with trans issues, but both race and trans issues. So like, I think the example that I gave in the article, I was talking about a steel mill in Gary, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And the steel mill has like DEI programs. I don't know if people know where Gary, Indiana is. It's this like tiny old industrial town. It's kind of like the picture of industrial rot and like lack of job opportunities. So it's, economically depressed. It's largely, it has a large Black population as well. And I'm imagining like a trans guy who's working at this steel mill in Gary, Indiana. And I think I have this line, which is like, maybe it's not the best thing for this guy if his colleagues are feeling like they have to walk on eggshells around him. If there's a culture in the steel mill, which is like you kind of bust each other's balls over things, and the jabs are part of how camaraderie works, maybe creating this legislative framework which makes it so the state and progressive activists in New York and California are, I'm so sorry.
Are you okay? No, you're good. You're good. Do not worry. You were speaking of the Gary, Indiana steel mill. And
and it was a brilliant, it was such a eloquent monologue. Yeah, no, okay. So I think that like, he's probably not benefited if he can't negotiate the boundaries himself. If instead the boundaries for like what isn't acceptable behavior, if those are negotiated by people who are in California or New York, progressive activists who, really have very different standards for what is acceptable language than maybe he does, then that can actually like really hurt him. And so I say like, if you have this, I think the phrase that I use is this hard son of a bitch, this trans guy in Gary, Indiana, like maybe he wants to set what is appropriate and not appropriate himself. There are examples of, I think like a Tesla factory in Texas where I am, where Hispanic and Black coworkers were, again, just like, busting each other's balls. Occasionally the language would get like racial and they got hit with a discrimination lawsuit. And, I really can't say what like a Black guy in Texas working at like a Tesla plant feels like is appropriate or not appropriate language. But I do think it should be up to him to determine that and not someone in California. And ultimately, like maybe the trans guy in Gary, Indiana, or the Black guy in Texas, maybe they really do want like these muscular protections for civil rights and against certain uses of language. I think that's totally fine. I think that's a good thing. And I think companies will institute those protections because, as something that I talked with you about, a lot of times these protections really do serve a market purpose. Like employees like them. Employees like having the diversity, equity, inclusion groups. They like having that outreach. They like having these special interests groups within the company.
Affinity groups, sometimes they're called. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
It's back. Okay. I think we're back. Cool. Amazing. So you were saying is you would prefer, or you think that maybe there's evidence to suggest that it's better to have these private actors, at least in certain areas, negotiate the boundaries, negotiate the cultures within their workplaces, as an example of private discrimination, better than this like race to the top that is occurring, maybe from places that are out of touch with these localities. The first thing I want to do is steelman some aspects of what you're saying here, if that's okay. So I think that the economics of litigation does sometimes produce perverse incentives, and people, not just TERFs, I'm just joking, not just people who are critical in general of civil rights frameworks because of ideological or broader ideological concerns, have pointed to this. So for example, right, like, because oftentimes it makes more sense for large organizations to just settle, as opposed to weathering complex litigation that is marshaled oftentimes by plaintiffs' attorneys firms. Oftentimes what you'll have is you will have increasing standards and basically a group of enforcement lawyers that are pushing to constantly increase the standards. And that can be perverse, right? Like there can be some times where things that are not discriminatory in the slightest, notwithstanding that, there's $1 million settlements because there are proposed class actions that make it crazy for a big corporation to like bet the bank that they're not going to get some either a jury or a judge that is going to hit them with $100 million settlement or something, or $100 million judgment or something. And so that can create sometimes an incentive to avoid that litigation in the first place, and not go to, like, I don't know, the market efficient rate of DEI programs or protections, that kind of thing. And so I think that there is a potential for that issue, certainly. And I think it's about calibrating where we are, and to what extent we're fearful of overcorrecting. And I think that what you're describing here is a problem potentially of overcorrection. I also think, though, to be fair, there's a problem potentially of undercorrecting. The way that you're talking about some of these employee situations where, they just want to be able to shoot the shit and like insult each other. And I could even say that sometimes it could be appropriate, given the context, for some truckers to say some shit, and maybe it even undermines.
Not things that I would say.
Yeah. I would never say so. Maybe it's inefficient economically even, or for morale to police their language or something. But I mean, it's also potentially a problem to, you can think about the following situation, the locker room talk situation, where the exclusion is not coming because the rules are too strict, but it's because they're too loose. And what you have is, a culture develops in a workplace that is very off-putting to women. It makes them feel either unsafe or like they're being passed over, or that they can't be included in the same way in like group activities, that kind of thing. How do you navigate? Because I think you would acknowledge conceptually there's a problem with both overcorrection and undercorrection. What is making you convinced that there, at least in certain places, there's an overcorrection problem? What's for you the thing that's pushing you that way?
Well, I mean, I guess just to dig in on the undercorrection problem a little bit here, I think I can imagine a sort of basic response, which is just to say, if you have a company that really does have this like locker room talk problem, it's hostile to women are complaining, so it's pretty serious. It seems like, in a sort of basic way, there's a really big incentive for the company to correct on that and to institute policies which prevent that kind of behavior at the workplace. So in that case, it seems like there probably doesn't need to be a federal law for that, because the company is naturally incentivized to that. So you imagine this in like a different situation where it doesn't have that market incentive, or help me visualize this a little bit better.
Sure. Are you going to share your screen? Let me know so I can show it.
Me?
Oh, how are you going to visualize it? You said you wanted to visualize it a little bit.
Oh no, I just
for
want
yourself.
I'm asking for you to like paint the picture a little bit more, because I'm trying to visualize it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So, for example, right? You're saying that issues like where there's a toxic culture, they'll correct themselves in the modern era. That wasn't
At least
true.
to some extent, right?
Potentially that's true, but you would acknowledge that wasn't true back in the 60s when these frameworks were passed, right? Like there was not a self-correcting issue with public discrimination in places of public accommodation, private discrimination in places of public accommodation, or with these employers. Like they just weren't hiring black people. So basically what I'm asking, like,
no, I mean, I think there is,
yeah, go for it.
I think there is reason to think that there was like market corrections happening. So like kind of an interesting example of this is the desegregation of sports teams. There were black athletes that were performing super well in their own leagues, and the white only leagues had sort of an agreement. It really was a cartel among the players where all of these white players like refused to participate with black players. And so they were able to like effectively block out the black players from participating. But it didn't take long once the first few teams started experimenting with having black players on the team to realize that, oh, wait, there's a huge advantage to letting black players participate on the team because, you know, they're great at sports, and, you know, they're working with our guys, and, you know, maybe this racism thing is like a little bit overblown here, and so we can relax a little bit. Of course, they were still, you know, absurdly racist, but they realized that there was like a market incentive, that they got lots of viewers as soon as they brought on these black guys to work with their otherwise white teams. And so pretty quickly the dominoes fell, and the public, you know, they just wanted to see like the best sports at the highest level. And there was I think that the teams kind of followed suit pretty quickly. And so I think that like given enough time, I do think you would see things shift, especially once firms like, you know, one firm starts banning the locker room talk, and suddenly like they have access to this huge female workforce that are great employees and they're not wanting to be hired elsewhere. That's pretty effective for the company. And so then the company that doesn't have that locker room talk starts outcompeting other ones, others follow suit. I do think that there's precedent for something like that to happen.
For market correction. Okay, so you would challenge the assumption that, would you challenge the assumption that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was even needed? Would you challenge that assumption? You think culturally we were swinging that way anyway, and we would have ended up roughly in a similar spot? Or
I mean, it's so hard to tell. Yeah. I just think that there is like precedent for a market correction there.
But let me make it more concrete. If you were in the halls of Congress in 1964, and you know, Title VII were before you, would you vote in favor?
I don't know if I would vote in favor of Title VII. I don't know. Maybe not. We'll see.
No, sorry. I won't put you down on that. But okay. Then help me out a little bit here. Because I never said this was going to be an easy interview, Taf. You have to understand. Because you're like, okay, let the employers figure it out. Let the employers figure out what's best for them. And if that means, you know, correcting to the maximum extent for gains, let them do it. And if that means not doing it to whatever extent that means doing it, if that means having DEI, I think you would say that would justify DEI for some corporations if they so choose to attract the best talent, and that's all fair game. Then why are you in favor of Trump getting rid of the affirmative action in public employment? I mean, really, the government is just another employer, and you're basically saying it was really great for the Trump administration, as you say in your article, to undo the affirmative action with respect to public employment. All I'm saying, it sounds like you do have a stake in the race, and you actually think that the DEI policies are stupid and bad and wrong. That you might agree with the freedom of organizations to be able to do it, and maybe there's a public-private distinction here that you have in your mind. So I'm not going to say that that you have to accept my framing. You don't have to accept my framing. But isn't it the case, though, that you don't want the government to be able to come to that determination? You flat out do not want the government to be engaged in what you think private employers should be allowed to engage in. And if that's the case, why? Is it because you have a principled position against DEI and affirmative action? Or is it because you think the government specifically, as opposed to other employers, shouldn't be engaged in this kind of practice that is DEI?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I'm not actually against the government engaging in this kind of legislation in principle. I think if the government does it really well, then that's like totally fine. So I could like imagine, let's say you put someone in charge of the government and they're just like, they're totally cracked out of their mind and they're like really good at making these decisions and they can analyze all sorts of different scenarios and they can be like, you know what, objectively, I just know that this like steel mill, they're going to be like maximally, spiritually fulfilled, not even just like economically, but like the employees are going to be like totally happy with this amount of like line in the sand. You're allowed to like say these words, but not these words.
Right.
I think, that's probably fine. I think my issue with the government is I just don't think that the government is generally very efficient in making these decisions and has overreached in certain cases, and therefore it should be scaled back a bit.
Got it. I got it. So I guess what I'll ask is, in principle, doesn't seem like you're against DEI to the extent that like it seems like DEI is a kind of preference, a race-based preference, or a group-based preference in certain areas, and that is something you seem to be okay with private actors being engaged in, either for leveling down or leveling up with respect to their different employment policies. So it doesn't sound like in principle you're against affirmative action if it's just the freedom of someone to engage in that affirmative action. Just like, for example, you would be okay, I guess, conceptually with a private actor having the right to say no blacks need apply. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not, right? Because again, I go back to this point, which is I'm not like a super like radical libertarian, and I think it's like okay if the government sort of steps in to provide these minimum protections, especially for groups that are maybe like most vulnerable. So I think it's probably okay if the government says things like, you can't have a no blacks need apply.
It can't be that explicit.
It's really good.
And I think this is one area that you might have some agreement with me, because it can be hard. I recently examined the Mahmoud Khalil decision by a judge in the District of New Jersey, and he didn't actually rule on the First Amendment issue. He ruled on a due process issue, and the due process issue was, well, the determination that's making Mahmoud Khalil allegedly deportable is this kind of vague generality that the Secretary of State may determine in his discretion that you are, perverse or anti the interest of the United States foreign policy. Well, how the hell are you supposed to order your life if you're a resident alien in the country based on the kind of vague standards at issue there? Now, the courts have further clarified. They've had this McDonnell-Douglas burden shifting framework. As you talk about, the courts have elaborated a little bit. But fundamentally, it is difficult sometimes for firms to be able to predict what's going to be okay, what's not going to be okay, what's the level of due diligence, what's the level of, the structure of their employment hiring and promotion systems that they need to be concerned about. And so, I'm a little bit sympathetic there, but it sounds like you're not ready to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Where do you see a place for the government still using these kinds of frameworks? Is it just about, is it more clarity? Is it getting rid of burden shifting? Fee shifting. So fee shifting, for those who don't know, is if you win one of these cases, your attorney's fees are paid. And so that obviously creates an incentive, basically reimbursing litigation in that sense, and that incentivizes litigation. And sometimes there's even treble damages provisions for certain kinds of anti-discrimination frameworks. You're holding back from fully saying, all right, let's get rid of it all. What do you want to remain in your ideal world, and maybe tailor it specifically for trans people, of this civil rights framework?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I wish I had like a crystal ball to know what would be like best. I just don't have that at the end of the day, because it's hard to like understand for something like fee shifting, like how much does that contribute to negative downstream effects? I don't know. But my intuition is that there's like a dial here, and we need to turn that dial down and see kind of where it gets us. And I would do that pretty conservatively, quite frankly. So I would not make like radical moves, but you shift it a little bit with things like that. So like, fee shifting is like a good one to bring up, because you can turn the dial like really subtly with something like that, where you could just make it like a little bit harder to do the fee shifting, or you could make it so like, fee shifting has like a cap on it or something. And those techniques can be pretty liquid. You can modify them up and down. And yeah, I think that would be a good place to start.
Okay, so that's fair. So what you're saying here, this is not a white paper on a policy. You're just noticing an issue. Yeah, and you're just saying whatever the solution is. I'm not here to you're not providing.
I'm an ex-OnlyFans model, Pisco. I wish I knew.
Listen, I think that people from all backgrounds can have wonderful insights on policy.
Thank you.
But I recognize, and I'm not trying to put you in the position of like coming up with the perfect legislation. And I even think it's a little unfair, maybe, because I think we had this specific conversation now that I'm recalling it, and so a little unfair to put you on the spot of like what the specific is. Needless to say, you're just identifying what you feel to be an issue and suggesting that maybe we consider methods to taper it back. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I smarter people than I hope look into it. Read my article and
think
about it.
Let's get back to messaging before going to freedom. On messaging, is a trans woman a woman?
I wrote an essay at one point, and I argued no. There's no philosophically coherent definition in which trans women are women. I think I've actually back down on that position. I do think there's like a philosophically coherent definition of woman that includes trans women. It's probably something like a trans woman, or a woman is someone who identifies sincerely as a woman, and that identification correlates to either biological reality or cultural expectations of womanhood or femininity, something like that.
My idea is
if I were to sit down, I would.
No, I'm glad that you backed away from that position, because I totally agree with you. I think that it is a coherent concept to have trans women be included in women. I know that you're a little hesitant on that. I understand that you're still figuring it out, or you're still maybe you're
philosopher Chads might get me on some technicality.
Sure, but it seems like a cluster concept that when people refer to woman, they're not referring to your gametes. They're referring to clusters of traits associated with the biological sex of woman. But we didn't even know what gametes were, or chromosomes were, for the majority of the time that we were using the term woman. So it can't be the case, right, that the term women, for the majority of the history of its usage, relied on these kind of inherent biological traits. There has to be something associated with women that is broader than just the specific biological sex, which again, the science on that is, from a long look at human history, fairly recent. And so I agree with you that there is and I actually think that the best concept of woman is a cluster concept. We're talking about clusters of traits, and sometimes they're hard cases. Just by the way, for like every word, right? It's hard. Like, what's a chair? What's a bed? What's this or that? Like, there's going to be clusters of traits for these words, and no one can define perfectly what a chair is. No one can define perfectly what an apple is. There's going to be hard cases and then easy cases. But no, I completely agree. But that's kind of the semantic discussion and the philosophical discussion. Why is it so toxic to push what you are at least saying is likely a coherent concept, right? Like, and by the way, I think it's the best reading of the term woman would include trans women. I don't think it's just self-ID. As you mentioned, it wouldn't be sufficient for it to be self-ID. That is, I think, one of the traits, that identification and how one feels is one of the clusters of traits. But why would it be wrong? And another one of the examples, by the way, is I think that objectively there are more than two sexes. I think that that's borne out in the science. And we can talk about that more if you'd like. Why would it be wrong on messaging grounds to push for things, either a true concept or a true scientific fact? Why would that be wrong in terms of messaging? Or what are the pitfalls that might present themselves for people who are pushing what, in my opinion, are true conceptually or true scientifically?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I said it's a coherent concept. That's a I think, a pretty low bar here. I just mean that it's like not vacuous. It's not self-contradictory. And
But you don't think it's what people mean when they say woman, Taff? I mean, like, really, when someone says woman, or they say, look at that woman over there, do you think that they're saying that person has small gametes or large gametes? I mean, that's clearly the way people use the term woman is not just biologic reality. So I'm just talking about common usage here. The way people use the term commonly, I think it matches common usage.
I think there is a bit of a philosophical wrinkle here, which is you can imagine like people defining like the word like horse,
right?
Before people understood genetics, or people understood like that animals had distinct cells from plants, before they understood any of this kind of cellular automata or any of the stuff that you'd need a microscope
right,
to really
before they mapped out the horse genome, there was a concept of horse. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
And yet I still think that they are fundamentally, they have a conceptual category which is pointing at the horse genome. They don't know about the horse genome yet, but I think that you can imagine definitions as, this is like so in the weeds philosophy stuff, but like you can imagine definitions as being kind of like a chain, where like horse looks a certain way, right? It's got like 4 legs, you can mount it, it has hair. So you can like have a definition of horse, which is like sort of just based on the visuals. The reason horses have 4 legs and you can mount them and they have hair and stuff is because, well, is downstream of their genetics, right? So when someone is like defining a word horse and like they say all of these things and you point out to them, you're like, well, what about a fuzzy chair? What about a chair that I have made with like faux fur? Is that a horse? And they're like, okay, no, that's not a horse. The reason they can say that and have that saying make sense is because there is actually some sort of concept that they're trying to map with language imprecisely, but that concept is probably most correctly correlated to something that they don't necessarily know about. Like
no
genome.
doubt it's correlated to that, but like I guess the question is like, is a rocking horse a
horse? I would say it's like downstream from that. And so whatever the concept, whatever the definition is, which is like most true for that person, for the concept that they're trying to point to, it can rely, I think, on things that they don't know about. So when people talk about woman throughout, human history, I do think that most people are referring actually to like some sort of biological reality,
right? But it's not defined by it, right? So like the term woman, I think
because they don't have the language for it, right? But I think if they had the language, they would.
Right, but I think you have to grant this. If by definition they don't have any knowledge about gametes or chromosomes, then by definition, like it must be impossible for the definition of woman to rely on concepts to which they don't have access. That must follow. The semantic meaning of the term woman can't rely, and at least could you agree with this?
I think the word, okay, so here's what I would say. You know how people use like the analogy of like map and territory, right?
I'm not understanding it. You'll have to explain. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's a philosophy thing where people will distinguish between the map and the territory. So they'll be like, you can have like a landscape, spread out in front of you, this vast breadth of mountains and hills and forests and stuff. That's what actually exists out there in the world. And you can create a map of it. So you can create like a diagram that's depicting it. And when it comes to linguistics, we can think of like words as kind of like the map, where they're like pointing to something that actually exists in the real world.
Yep.
But the it's fuzzy. The definition is like not high enough resolution to accurately model the territory. And so I think that like, imagine we have a map and like you're sketching out the map and it doesn't include something that's like on the other side of a mountain. So you can't actually see it. I think that like your map, which is, I think what you're calling like the definition, right? It sort of like fundamentally cannot include something that you don't have vision of, right? That's what you're saying.
What I mean to say is that
like you couldn't map that.
All I mean to say is, this is all I'm saying, is that the meaning of a word, take for example, woman, that the meaning of the word that people, that is to say, what people mean by when they use that term woman can't be concepts to which they have no understanding of, or things that they don't know. Right? So how can woman in the 1800s mean small gametes? Woman must refer to some other concept. It must refer to clusters of traits. It must refer to sex organs. It must refer to a combination of stuff. It can't refer. That is to say, the word itself to these people, when they're using the term, they're not meaning someone with a human genome with large gametes. That cannot be what they're referencing when they use that term before they even have a concept of what a gamete is. That is to say, the subjective mind of that person is not saying, oh, woman because large gametes. That's not what's going on in their head. That must be like true, right? Like, how can we say that a person is, when they use a term, is referring to something that they truly have no idea exists? They are not meaning that when they say the term woman. They're meaning something else.
Okay, here's what I think we can like fundamentally agree on. They're not saying that, right? So they're not saying gametes, and they're not thinking gametes. Like the conceptual category of gametes is nowhere in that
correct
analysis. So I think that's what we're agreeing on here.
Yep.
What I'm trying to like get you to imagine is that. And again, please just bear with me with this analogy. You've got this map, and you don't see the backside of a mountain. So like you don't know what to fill in on the map here, right? So there's no way that your definition, your map, can include what's behind
you. You don't know, right? Yeah.
But if someone were to like come and tell you, be like, oh, now I know what's on the backside of that mountain, you would update your map.
You would update the definition, right? So the definition would change.
But why is that, right? Because your definition is pointing to something concrete, which is this territory that actually exists out in the world. So even if you don't know like what the exact contours of that territory is, you know that there's a territory out there. You're trying to describe it with what you have, which is the map. So I think that you can imagine definitions like that, where people they're trying to define a horse or a woman, and they don't necessarily have like the words or the concepts to describe like gametes, but they have the territory in front of them and they're trying to get at it. So I think that you can imagine that like a definition of woman pre, in the 13th century or whatever, doesn't have gametes, right? But they're trying to describe something which is fundamentally downstream from gametes.
I totally agree. But then what we're describing is a definition, if we accept that definition, that is changing. And what the people will have you believe, and this is the reason why I'm arguing this, I'm going to take a big step back. Why we're having this is, in order for someone to convince me that progressives are barking up the wrong tree in terms of their messaging, in arguing something I take to be true, it's going to be a high threshold. It's going to be like, you shouldn't argue things that are true because it's so like my prior is we should be arguing things that are true. So, but if I think that something is true and you're telling me I shouldn't argue for that, I'm going to impose, I'm like, wait, why should I not be arguing for things that are like true? Is it like some kind of forbidden knowledge or something? That's why I'm kind of pushing on this, because we're taking a step back. The article is about progressives' failings. And by the way, I'm open to the notion that progressives are failing. And I think it's an article that piqued my interest. And I think it's intentionally provocative. I think it's, I very much enjoy reading it. So I'm doing this because I do this to everybody. But I just want to say, 100%. And you guys should all read it. And I put the link in before. The reason I'm saying this is, if there's something that I take to be true, I'm going to need you to like really convince me that it's not worth it. And I think that when people try to say, well, woman means this, I don't think that that's how most people use the term woman in actual daily life. And that there's and it doesn't entail gametes. And we know that for the majority of human history, this concept of woman and the various different words that were used to represent the concept of woman were completely agnostic, unrelated, or that is to say, I shouldn't say unrelated, because there was some objective relation.
Definitely related.
Yeah. But I mean to say is that the terms themselves did not mean.
Literally contained those words.
Correct, yeah. And so this is a change that it's a recent phenomena that the term woman is being argued for to include gametes and to include chromosomes. I mean, that's, and that it's not necessary for us words are just the usage of the term. And I think the actual useful concept of gender, the actual useful concept of women that people use isn't gametes dependent. And the proof is also, by the way, I think in the pudding, when people look at you, Taf, and I have people in my who are in the chat, they're like, wait, Taf is trans? And they were referring to you as a woman and she, without any conception of your gametes or your chromosomes. And so I think in the average lived experience, the term woman does not typically imply some just straight reference without looking at any other factor to people's gametes. It's a cluster. It includes the gametes, I would agree. It includes chromosomes. It includes biological sex. It includes external organs, but it's not the only thing. And sometimes, notwithstanding the fact that you have large gametes, or small gametes, you are going to be a woman. And that will be true. It'll be true because the term woman is not just big gametes, and it's not just XX chromosomes. I'll let you respond to that. We will move on.
I love how passionate you are. That's incredible. I mean, okay, I guess the other part of this is I think you can sort of use the sounds like woman to point to any sort of object.
Sure.
So I think that if someone were to use woman to refer to like a pencil or something, I don't think that would be like objectively untrue. I think it's a sort of a argument of semantics. I think that different languages use different sounds to point to different things and different symbols. I don't think that they're like objectively wrong for using that, or someone's objectively wrong for like pronouncing it a different way. And so similarly, when it comes to the term woman, I think that there are other coherent definitions of woman that are not like the one that you've laid out. So like earlier I said that it's not incoherent to include trans women. I think I agree with that. I think that's
but philosophically. It's a low bar. It just means it doesn't imply contradiction. And so you've given
exactly.
Okay. But I'm going one step beyond and saying it's not just that it's not coherent. I'm arguing that it's the majority usage of the term, that as people actually use the term woman, they're using my my coherent concept of woman, not what I would say is the reactionaries, or I shouldn't say that, the other definition of woman, which is large gametes. I think
I can concede that for the purposes of the discussion, and like assume that people do use your definition, the maybe more progressive definition, more standardly or as a standard. I think that's definitely true within progressive areas. I think it's not so true in red state areas. And so what I'm getting at with the article in general is that you have these definitions which work really well within certain communities, often communities where this messaging is originating, where these lawyers are studying and eventually getting their start before going and arguing before the Supreme Court. Well, these people are operating on definitions which work for their communities, but you take them to somewhere else and suddenly they're creating like a lot of division. And I don't think that like banging on about insisting that everyone adopt your definition is necessarily the most helpful, because for me, like I don't really care if someone thinks of me as a man or a woman, as long as they think that I have the freedom to wear the kind of clothes I want and make the kind of cosmetic alterations to my body that I want. And so what I get at again and again in the article is that actually I think defending trans rights on this basis is easier than going to people who have like locked in positions about the definition of woman and trying to get them to like get rid of everything they think they know. Instead, I say, get them to just agree that I can like wear the kind of clothes I want. That's much easier.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that point, and I want to get to the instrumental. So we're gonna leave this part of the conversation, but I want to give one last word on it and say I have a stronger position on it, in the sense that I think when conservatives say you can't force this definition on us, I think that they're delusional. I think that they are using the definition of woman without knowing it, without a concept of woman that isn't exclusive to gametes. You have to understand, right? Like the conception of what the definition of woman should be for a lot of these conservatives is it's merely defined by your gametes, or it's merely defined by your chromosomes. And it's my position that to think that when people use the term woman, even these conservative people, that they're trying to do that, right? Like, or I'm not gonna say everyone, but like I think most normal people aren't using, even the ones who are ideologically against trans people aren't using this gametes exclusive definition. And only in these conversations about the definition itself do those arguments come up where they're just like, resistant to the notion of a cluster concept in general, which I'm glad to see that you're not, and that you acknowledge that it's coherent. But let's get to the, I take your point that for you, what's more important is freedom. And what's more important to you is liberty, as opposed to these kinds of messaging arguments about what a woman is. So talk to me a little bit about, well, first talk to me about the instrumental effects that you think of bad messaging from the Democrats. You think that it's causing people to stop supporting trans people, and then talk to me about what freedom means to you in the context of trans rights.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned someone earlier who came up in my article, which is Christine Jorgensen. And Christine is this trans person who transitioned in the 1950s. And you can find newspaper articles about her from the time. And there are things like ex-GI becomes blonde bombshell. And it's like a picture of her on the front page. And she looks pretty, and she's, she becomes a kind of like socialite. People are obsessed with her at the time. She's very much a celebrity. And so this, I think, probably strikes people a little bit weird to hear that in the 1950s, at a time when America was still deeply segregated, where many states had laws against homosexuality.
They're transpositive.
At the same time, it's like weirdly transpositive. Yeah. And you actually like dig into these articles and you have people arguing that like her gender transition is proof of like America being a great country because our scientists are like so incredible, and that like, the West has produced this wonderful, miraculous like medicine, and this ability for people to change their sex when, it doesn't suit them, which is like a weird sort of argument that you can imagine people making today, but certainly you wouldn't imagine like being a sort of nationalistic stand or position. So I think that's weird for people.
At the same time, so what's weird about that? So what are you saying is weird for people? That it's,
I think
good.
Yeah, no, I think it's weird for people to realize that in the 1950s, the conversation about this trans person was in some ways more transpositive than we would see today.
But in fact, really, I want to push a little bit on this. Sorry to interrupt you. I agree that it's really super interesting that you bring this case up. I didn't know anything about it, and it's shocking to me. But it seems like it's a novelty. Right. It's and part of the reason why people might take umbrage at your comparisons to body modification is perhaps they hadn't fully realized the society altering implications of men becoming women, in that unlike body modification, unlike, going to the freak show or something, when you start to internalize and think about, well, what does that mean? It is a challenge to establish hierarchy in the family, establish hierarchy in society. And so, okay, maybe there was this like interest before there was a realization that these long entrenched hierarchies maybe were being questioned and maybe should have been, or some people were advocating that they ought to be torn down. And so is this real trans acceptance in the 1950s, or do you think it's something else?
Well, there's two things that are going on here. One of those things is that, like you were saying, I think that people in the 1950s would still have a lot of problems if they sort of knew what transness looked like now, right? So if you were to like be able to go back in the past and you were to tell them like, well, this is like the current state of trans discussion, I don't think that they would be like really transpositive then, right? And so they're not transpositive in the sense that like deport them today, they're going to be like, well, I don't like black people, but those trans people, they're fine. They're not going to say that, right? They're trans people in the sense that you're saying that it's like an oddity, it's a quirk, it's a one-off. And as a one-off, they see it as an example of, science being impressive and, what have you. At the same time, this is the other thing. She does have lots of detractors. So there are people who see her as like someone who has turned on her maleness. And in fact, like in the conversations about her, people use this language a lot where they're like, she's a XGI, she's a deserter on the cause of maleness. They really like load it with a lot of this like moral baggage, kind of focusing on the fact that she was once this like example of masculinity and now she is, wearing mink, and they kind of make fun of her in some ways for not being like feminine enough. So like they make fun of her fashion choices, which is like ridiculous and catty. But you see that. So
they were investigating back in the 1950s.
Yeah. They're like, are you really that feminine? You don't even know the difference between mink and nutria. Yeah. So she gets that. She gets lots of transphobia. So I don't want to paint it as like a rosy picture. But what I think is important here is that when it comes to people modifying their bodies, there's actually a long history of Americans doing this, Americans sort of being fascinated with it, and Americans not really being that opposed to it. So even in the modern day, I give other examples. I talk about Botched, which is this plastic surgery TV show.
Yep. And you have the image here.
Yeah, I got images in the article.
You talk about
millions
the
of people
man,
watch this.
Yes,
the lizard man.
Yeah. Oh, but you said millions of people watch the show, Botch? Is it a show?
Yeah, so it's a TV show. Yeah. You can find like clips on YouTube and whatnot. And people think it's weird. People think that these people are mentally ill, insane. Some people think that like, oh, it's kind of cool if they can change their bodies. People's opinions vary. I would say in general, they're kind of like vaguely negative on this sort of stuff. But there aren't national conversations about banning, people from tattooing their skin green and getting subdermal implants like the lizard man did, right? And so we sort of treat these people as oddities, but ultimately we respect their right to radical body modification, which goes, quite frankly, much far beyond what any trans person is doing. Like it's much more ostentatious and in your face if you've tattooed scales all over your body or tattooed your eyeballs black or you've gotten like, triple H cup breasts. All of those things are like much more
visually
noticeable.
Challenging.
Yeah, totally. And so I think that, I'm drawing this comparison intentionally because I think that it's a good example of how Americans, even conservative Americans, will just be like, whatever, they're kind of freak shows. They can do their own thing. They're not bothered by it until I think it becomes this national conversation, like with transness, where people are coming into their workplace and they're saying, you have to affirm like our metaphysical definition of woman or you're going to get fired. Your company is going to get slapped with this lawsuit. I think as soon as the government sort of steps in and starts regulating those things, then people get really upset. And so my point with the article is refocus on the freedom, allow people to get these cosmetic modifications and treat them like other things that people broadly respect and believe Americans should be able to do.
And allow them to, and you point to polling data as well, that in general, there's less agreement among Americans that some of these issues related to like sports or bathrooms, that these don't have as much broad-based support as compared to like the general proposition that one ought not discriminate against trans people. So I find that interesting. And I do think that there are some arguments that are being lost. And by the way, that I'm not convinced on. I'm not convinced that, the highest level of competitive sports either in college or in the professional leagues, that I think that sex discrimination makes sense in a lot of these leagues. Not in every league, if it's like a chess thing, or if it's a co-ed league, or if it's recreational sports. I play sports with women all the time. But in certain, that's why when people say trans women in sports, I think they need to be more specific than that, and they need to talk about specifically what people are up in arms about. So definitely agree that the trans issue, it's a multiple, right? And I think that that's something that you identify in the article, and we'll talk more about what trans freedom means to you. But I want to go back real quick to the body modification aspect of what you point out. Because one, you'd be okay with people firing Lizard Man because he turns into Lizard Man. I'm guessing, right? If you're working at a restaurant and you turn into Lizard Man, you're saying it's okay for the employer to fire Lizard Man. And you know what? I probably would agree with you that firing Lizard Man is okay because they're Lizard Man. And look at me, I'm okay with some discrimination in that sense, because okay. So, wow. Does that? All right. I guess I'll ask the chat real quick. Chat, who thinks that you should not be able to fire Lizard Man because they're Lizard Man, right? So Lizard Man, in all other respects, is a good employee, but the owner, let's say, of a restaurant or a bank where this person's a teller, says, "Well, he's a good employee, but he just turned into Lizard Man. Should you be able to fire Lizard Man because they're Lizard Man?" And so I'll just give you guys 30 seconds, and we'll see some of the comments here. Okay to discriminate on the basis of your lizard fantasy, or you wanting to physically resemble more lizard. Some people say protect Lizard Man, let the gamblers work it out. I don't know what that means. Is it just a persona, or are they a lizard? It's a human being who is trying to approximate the physical, some kind of physical hybrid of a lizard, and to look more lizard-like.
He just looks wacky.
Yeah, it looks a little wacky. Nope, Lizard Man stays. Lizard Man should have protections. No, again, not just general protections. Protections on yes, they're wearing clothes. Protections on the basis of their identity and physical transformation into this lizard type person. This is, in other words, it is kind of like the I identify as attack helicopter meme, right? We'll get into
but literal.
But literal. Justice for Lizard Man. Okay, don't just say protect Lizard Man because you now have an affinity to Lizard Man, because he'd be like just be honest.
I mean, the more you're saying,
the more I say Lizard Man, it sounds like
maybe we should protect
Lizard Man should be the boss. Okay, yeah, fire him. Okay, so I think most people could agree that some of these identities should not be protected. Here's where I think potentially, and you can address this analogy. The reason why there's not as much a concerted pushback to the body modification as there is to the trans situation is, one, the lizard stuff doesn't challenge the established hierarchy. Because A, the number of lizard men and body modification nuts, even though trans people are a very, very small population, this is my intuition, actually, I don't have numbers to back this up. If you called me on it, I wouldn't be able to provide it, but my guess is there are more trans people than body modification aficionados. Would that be your intuition as well? I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like extreme body modification, yes, that's my intuition.
Sure, if you have a little filler, if you have a little this, we're going to say that's not
there's all sorts of,
sure.
Yeah.
The trans stuff is fundamentally undermining an aspect of a pillar of conservative life. That is to say, the belief in traditional family, the nuclear family, a belief in a religious belief, right? God made Eve out of Adam's like rib, right, or dirt or something, and so it's not just a conservative value; it's also a religious value. These are hierarchies and structures and categories that were created by God. And God doesn't make mistakes like that. So that's in there as well. And so, who cares? I'm gonna let you address it, and you'll be the last word on it. Who cares? Says the person who's talking down to you about the physical strikingness of the body modification. That's not what people care about. The reason why there's a concerted effort against trans people is because of the challenge to the hierarchy, because of what it entails with respect to society, and it's an attack on God. And that's why the comparison is inapt. Your response?
Yeah, I think there's probably some Americans that would make an argument like that, like especially the particularly evangelical types, people for whom their opposition to transsexuality is rooted in just a strong religious ideal. I think that when you actually look at how Americans feel, though, even conservative Americans, I don't think you find people making this kind of argument. You know, so much of politics, I think, is so just fundamentally like a disgust response. And earlier you said that like most conservatives are not going to offer these like robust definitions for woman based on gametes. They're kind of just going to use woman in a way
what a
that
woman is. They'll
very
always say
visual.
it. Have you ever talked to those people?
Yeah,
Like, I don't need to tell you what a woman
for
is.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's vibes, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that like when you look at how people feel about trans people, I think a lot of it's vibes. I think a lot of people, they have an image of a trans person in their mind and like they don't pass, or they're sort of obnoxious, they have blue hair, they're screaming at someone, and they get an ick factor and they don't want to associate with that. And so I think that like for the same reason, you can sort of present these people with someone like Blair White or like a super passing trans woman, and they like don't care that much about that person. And I think that they like actually don't have like a super principled stance on this. I think they're just reacting to like the social media cultural conversation, which puts frontline a lot of trans people, which are kind of wild in appearance, very intentionally to provoke those kind of ick responses.
Well, that's interesting what you just
And
said there. I want to emphasize it real quick, because you just said basically like, or implied, I mean, tell me if I'm right, that like it's not as intellectual or conceptual or thought, well thought out as I'm potentially, providing that explanation for. That sometimes it's just an instant gut reaction, and hot trans people who pass, they're not, it's the ambiguity. It's this kind of like uncanny valley that disturbs people. Where they don't fit into one of their preordained boxes, and it's a lack of congruence between one of those boxes as opposed to the direct intellectual, conversation that's driving some of the opposition.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people, I'm sure there are lots of Americans, maybe not lots, but there are Americans that will give that really like principled stance that is based on religion and God and the family. I just don't think that most Americans are going to give that definition in the way that most Americans are not going to give a definition based on gametes, because they've simply never thought about it in that, depth. So, yeah, I guess my point being, I think the reason you bring this up is because you're saying, the lizard man, he sort of like is visually off-putting, but for trans people, you are maybe suggesting that there is discrimination against them, which is going to exist kind of like regardless of that. Like the visual thing is kind of like ancillary. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah. So that, like, how would you respond to people who are like, the resistance to trans people isn't caused by their visualness? And I'm framing this, and you can reject the framing, and obviously you have your own opinions, and so I'm just presenting it to you, and I want to know your response. That it's not the visualness of it, and really, like, it's about the challenge to the hierarchy. It's a challenge to the orthodoxy. That is what potentially people are pushing back against. That it's not really how much of a challenge you are visually in that sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, we talked about how I think this maybe not like majority of people, but that applies to some people.
Right. Yeah.
So taking the argument to the conclusion, I feel like you are going somewhere with that, which is maybe like this matters because in terms of regulating against discrimination, maybe we can't expect the market to fully anticipate these people or something like that. That's where you're going.
Potentially charting whose responsibility is, right? Like if it's the case that the resistance to trans people is rooted in something ideological or hierarchical, then I'm less willing to accept that it's a reaction to overzealous progressives. But maybe if it is rooted in kind of, the opposition is rooted in people who are overstepping, or systems that are overstepping, or systems that are overcalibrating, as opposed to something hierarchical, maybe I'm more apt to accept that, hey, there's a problem here, and it's because we're fighting the war on the wrong fronts. And so I think it might be relevant in terms of what your preferred legal framework is, but it's more about charting, where does this come from? Right? Because you're suggesting that there are other challenging body modifications that don't seem to engender this kind of resistance. And so what is different about this? Well, what's different about this perhaps is the level, the stupid decisions perhaps of the progressives, or maybe it's because something ideological among conservatives, or maybe it's a mix. And so I'm presenting charting the cause of this, I think is integral to your article and its thesis, right?
Yeah, totally. Okay. Thank you for elaborating that. And yeah, like I said before, I think that most people's objection to transness is rooted in the kind of
disgust.
Visual, immediate disgust response. Okay. Yeah, it's all, I think, very sort of like instinctual and not that well thought out. And for that reason, I do think it's important to be mindful of this in how you are advocating for trans rights, so that you are not, treading into this water where you're provoking people's just immediate antipathy. And I think the word that I used at the very beginning of the article was birthing person. There's so many examples like this, like little language games, which, again, they work within some circles, right? If you are like a hyper progressive and you work at a super progressive company and you are based in a progressive state, like, it's possible that no one in your job or your social circle has any real frustration with this term. Everyone's totally cool with it. They don't feel offended by it. Awesome. But
Anna Kasparian was bothered by it, and so
okay, even then, yeah. So even then, like, I think women will sometimes have frustrations with this, and I don't know if I can really blame them. People get particular about the language that is used, and I think it's good if we can respect that. Like, I think it's good if people can respect that I'm sort of particular about language, or trans people are particular about language, and they prefer to be referred to by certain pronouns. There needs to be an enormous amount of leeway given to trans people to negotiate those boundaries with the people around them. At the same time, there are workplaces and environments where you have a steel mill in Gary, Indiana, and they're being given DEI sort of like pablum, and
it doesn't fit.
They're reading about birthing persons, and they're thinking, why are these coastal elites trying to regulate my language in this totally absurd way, which just goes against like all of their immediate gut instincts? I think that's a big problem. And I think it's broadly made people pretty frustrated with the trans movement and not really gotten us the kind of victories we want. Like, I don't know about other trans people, but I would say in the top 10 list of things that I care about, use of gender neutral terms for pregnant people is not within that top 10. So I don't know why we are sort of dying on these hills when there's bigger fish to fry.
And it is true, by the way, that the the Biden administration, it was interesting, as I was reading their briefs, I think in the Dobbs litigation, the Solicitor General offered a brief, and they said, we're using the term a pregnant person here because we acknowledge that it's not just women who can get pregnant. I believe that's true, by the way. I believe that is true, that men can get pregnant. I think that's true even of, if you took the definition of woman and man, small gametes and big and large gametes. Just I'll give my take. You don't have to respond to it. But there are people with small gametes who have gotten pregnant and given live birth, and so even if you take that,
really,
yes. So people, I think it's called Sawyer syndrome, whatever. It's basically people.
But they just have like some AIDS.
They have uterus. They have they have a uterus, a fully functioning uterus.
Oh, but it's like implanted eggs or something.
Obviously, but if you have IVF,
Okay.
if you have an implanted egg in a uterus, you are still getting pregnant and you're still giving birth, right? So definitionally,
Okay.
there are men under that definition of men, where it's small gametes, who have uteruses and vaginas and have given live birth to a healthy baby. And so again, people laugh at that definitional term, but it is accurate, right? It is accurate to say, even if you take the definition of man or woman with the gametes definition, men can get pregnant. And people scoff and laugh. And I understand, maybe because there's this imposition on language. I get that, Taf, and I think that that's true. I think it is challenging for people. But the scientific reality is biological men can get pregnant. That is true. Now, you might say, well, yeah, they need help, but some women need help getting pregnant. They're no less pregnant because they got IVF than a man who gets pregnant because they have a uterus and they want, and it has happened, and there are documented cases of it. Now it might be the case that this kinds of imposition on language, despite the fact that they're true, and in my opinion, some of these impositions on language reflect a scientific reality. That is to say, that sex is more than a binary variable, that men can get pregnant, are, notwithstanding that, too challenging. I'll give you one little hypothetical or a question, and then I want to move on and understand, and I'll stop grilling you, because really I've been grilling you.
No, you're fine. You've been very gentle, quite frankly. You could have grilled me way more.
Okay, but here's hypothetical, or the response, the peanut gallery person. Activists are supposed to be challenging. It was challenging to people in the South for their language, for their societies, to have the freedom riders, to have people come in and say, hey, black people are allowed to vote and participate in white societies. And so, yeah, it's challenging and good. What is your response to that? Are you going to say, you can think that, but look at the outcomes? Or are you going to say, wrong time and place? Tell me your response.
I love talking to you because I love how you anticipate these things. And you're teeing me up. You're like, here's this one route that you can go down. No, I mean, I guess I would have to interrogate the peanut gallery person a little bit more to understand where their values lie here. If they really do just think that activists ought to be challenging and to shake things up, and that's an end unto itself. I'm not sure if I can give many arguments against that. It sounds like they just sort of believe it's good.
I don't think it's in and of itself. So if you talk to the peanut gallery, who's not me.
Okay, yeah, peanut gallery. What is the goal with this?
Yeah, it's challenging not for the sake of it. It's challenging because we have groups of people who we take to have the wrong ideas. And maybe sometimes it goes too far. And I acknowledge it, by the way, like the wokeness sometimes, and so some of the shit, I was arguing against a lot of the identity politics stuff when I was in college. I lost some friends. People called me an Uncle Jose because I was betraying Latinos. They don't say that anymore.
That's
not
crazy.
With this. Yeah, no. So I was arguing why are you pushing off conservative? And so people would look at me. If you saw me on college, I was never, in favor of a lot of the craziest aspects where we were excluding people on the basis of their thought, even conservatives, because I'm like this. I always want to engage people who think differently. Notwithstanding that, I would say, there are people who have wrong ideas, ideas that are bad and corrosive. And sometimes it's good to be challenging, right? Democrats, I will see this often, are resigned to the fact that they're going to lose the immigration fight. And for years, ever since, really the second half of Biden's term, they gave up on immigration. They were accepting Trump's framework on immigration. But now look at the numbers. We saw what Trump was doing, and the people are reacting negatively to it. And now the Democrats are starting to marshal some messaging to promote their case. And if they didn't challenge that established orthodoxy now from Trump, that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, that they're necessarily bad for our economies, that they're longstanding criminals, all that stuff. If they didn't try to push the narrative, then maybe we wouldn't see that kind of change in terms of the public polling, that kind of thing. Now, what you could respond and say, and I guess I'm running the argument for you, that polling, the left has been trying, and they've been failing, and it's been going the other way on polling on some of these areas. But I don't think that that's necessarily an indictment. Perhaps it's an indictment on the particular issues, but yeah, what's generally your response?
Yeah, well, I think the least interesting response, but the obvious one, which I think you've already referenced and people are thinking about, is the response of, well, we look at the consequences of this, and if at the end of the day, like more trans people are hurt by this, maybe we need to adopt like a different strategy, and maybe it's good to shake things up insofar as it achieves the kind of outcomes that you want. And maybe I could talk with the peanut gallery and they would say like, I do ultimately at the end of the day care about just what's best for trans people. Maybe we could land out somewhere like that. I think there's an interesting, or like a more interesting philosophical back and forth, which involves admitting that there are ideas that are corrosive, sort of fundamentally, which I don't think should be just left to fester or, exist, that do require being challenged, sometimes being challenged with force. And so I think it's interesting to acknowledge that. And I would say that like the definition of woman maybe doesn't rise to that level for me. So I would say like an idea that is like really corrosive is maybe like the idea that if someone had the idea that trans people are like spiritually like malignant, and their existence whatsoever was like an affront to God that must be like, rectified by any means possible. That kind of belief is like so radical that you probably need to be willing to like use force to like contain that person and like convince that person out of that, because otherwise they're going to be, a danger to themselves and others.
Yeah.
And so just the idea that like, woman is this thing, woman is like, large gametes, but I think you should have the freedom to dress how you want. That kind of belief system, I don't think is worth, taking up arms against or, engaging in super inflammatory discussions with. I think that kind of position I can let live.
J.K. Rowling, are you going to let J.K. Rowling live? Joan.
I would let her live in my, in my dictatorship. I rule the world.
Yeah.
She'll be spared. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think that just getting down to the fundamental values, my fundamental values are based around freedom of expression and bodily autonomy. And people can have different opinions about the metaphysics of what is or isn't a woman. But as long as they respect that freedom, I think I don't need to like get in their face about the arguments.
Does the freedom, so now let's talk about freedom. And I think it's a nice little cap end to this portion. And then you're gonna have to let me ask. I know we've been doing this now for 2 hours, but you're gonna have to let me ask you some general non-trans related questions. Otherwise, I'm gonna.
Yes. No, we've gotten.
Okay. But I need to ask.
I have more interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, sure. But though I think this has been interesting. Like, freedom, very easy to say, and it's up to us to define what is that. And I think you're very conscious of this in your article and in my conversations with you, specifically the one that we had before you wrote it, about what that means to you. I'll ask one question on it and then I'll let you elaborate further. Do you think that the fundamental freedoms associated with being trans include the right of trans people, while they're children, in consultation with their parents and doctors, to receive cross-sex hormones in preparation for a transition?
I don't. So I think that we prevent children from making decisions that are going to affect their body long term. I think we do that for a good reason, which is children cannot necessarily be expected to fully reason out whether or not those decisions are going to be good for them. And this is why we have laws against, children having sexual relationships with adults. I think that makes a lot of sense, because I don't think that we can trust children with the responsibility and consequences of something like sex. I think it's appropriate for the government and for society to step in and say, no, we're going to prevent children from doing this. You may believe that you're like ready for it, but it's not going to happen.
Regardless of the outcome, or it's just a principled matter with respect to a big decision. So like if now there's a lot of disputed about the science here. And there are actually some people who say, you know, for example, the UK famously banned the practice of, I believe, or at least maybe not a full-on ban, but severely limited or restricted it in some way, the ability and availability of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. And so there's dispute that I've seen in the scientific community about the effectiveness. But suppose that the effectiveness of it in terms of, now people again quibble about suicidal ideation versus suicidal attempts versus all that stuff. But suppose that it were just very clear that the empirics went through in a way that you found tolerable. I guess it's circular and defining it away, but in a way that would otherwise be compelling to you. Is that principle of of children being unable to make that kind of decision still overriding the empirics, assuming that they went through?
Yeah, well, okay. So the other part of this is that it's important for relevant parties. So in this case, medical experts, also the children's parents, people who have the child's best interests in mind, you know, whether that be a guardian or what have you. It's important that those people be able to help a child make a decision. And I think for medical decisions, that's an instance where the empirics really matter, because it's then society's responsibility to make sure that children get the best healthcare that they can. And like you said, if it's empirics are tolerable, if, for example, we get really good evidence that it improves like mental health outcomes, I think then there's a moral responsibility on the part of society to make sure that children get this healthcare.
I'm glad you say that, and because I think that circumstance, we would sometimes override the parents' decisions. Like for parents who like refuse to give the child the antibiotics that would save the child's life because of some religious thing, we would override the parents' decision there, or we would want society to override that decision.
If we thought that the parents did not have the child's best interest in mind.
So I'm glad to hear you say that, and that it's a matter of empirics. And I think that that's true as well, because if it weren't that, then it would be like, I don't know, we would be closing off all manner of potentially like dangerous surgeries, but that would otherwise, like in the long run, be life-saving, or maybe it's risky to impose chemotherapy on children. Then it certainly has the decision about whether to take chemo or not take chemo. But we're going to ban chemo if we can prove that over the long run, we're really going to trust. So I'm glad that you're not you're not a crazy. This wouldn't be Ancapistan. This would be like the opposite. It would be like some kind of Christian nationalist authoritarianism or some kind of thing, or some kind of ultimate
ANCAPs are the people who are like,
you should be able to
consent,
consent,
total freedom. Yeah. And I'm like, no, that's crazy.
So
I'm not taking the opposite either.
And you're not taking the opposite, which is to say children, you can never give them procedures no matter how good the consequences are. So I'm glad to hear you say that. You can now, I'll give you permission, speak more broadly about your conception of what liberty for trans people means to you. If it doesn't include those rights to childhood, what does it include?
Oh, I mean, it's something that I've already touched on so many times, so it's probably not that interesting of an answer. But for me, the two important things are the ability to cosmetically modify your body, and also to
for adults
for adults, and also to present the way you want with clothing, which I see as being a First Amendment issue. And the reason ultimately that I focus on these things is because I have concerns about the empirics. So I see lots of arguments about the medical benefit or the psychological benefit of hormones. And I used to be one of these people that just thought that the evidence was super strong. And then I eventually got into like internet debates with various people and got kind of like schooled on these things and was forced like actually really deeply read into them. And I think I was shocked, not that the evidence doesn't point in a specific direction, which is positive, but that the evidence overall is so weak in terms of methodological issues. And that concerned me because I do think that there's a world in which 5, 10 years down the road, the science is more settled and we find out that the psychological benefit is like very slight or it's kind of neutral. Or, it
Negative.
might turn out that it's negative. In which case, like, I still think in that scenario, people should have the right to change their body if they want to. And that for me is like a big piece of the freedom. It's not for society to make that decision for you.
Once
If
you're an
you
adult.
want to, yeah, once you're an adult, if you want to present a certain way, I think you should be able to do that because your body is yours. It's not owned by the state.
I appreciate that, and thank you for clarifying. I think that you've provided at least a very clear understanding of like the basic freedoms that you consider to be integral to the, trans people in America. The last question on the trans issue that I'll ask you is the following: are those freedoms really under threat? I mean, you say that progressives have betrayed the trans community. I assume that the betrayal relates to those fundamental freedoms in that you think, now again, you don't have to accept the framing, that potentially progressives have imperiled the fundamental freedoms. Like you're saying, you don't really care about the other stuff. You certainly don't care about trans people in sports. You don't care about like as much, right? I'm not saying that you don't never care about it in any circumstance, right? As much the use of proper pronouns, the semantic conversations, the metaphysical conversations. What you care about is those base fundamental freedoms. Is it fair to say that progressives, if that's what you view about those kind of, I would say, in your view, ancillary stuff, is it fair to say that progressive betrayed trans people if those freedoms are not under threat? In other words, my question is, are they under threat? And do you think that some of it relates to progressives overstepping, overcorrecting?
I do think that they're under threat. I think I was more concerned about them being under threat closer to the election. So Donald Trump, he had a lot more political capital in January, and there was a feeling like he can use this political capital on all sorts of things. And I think that if there was a push, to satisfy the culture war base, the base that really cares about trans stuff, I think that there could have been a real threat to those fundamental freedoms. Now, months on, and it seems like Trump has been embroiled in all sorts of political issues with tariffs and with the border and, just continual scandal. I think it seems less and less likely that that is going to be at the top of the agenda. So I'm less concerned about it. At the same time, for progressives who are really concerned about it and still believe that Trump is, coming after trans rights, I don't think they're totally crazy for believing that. I still think that there's a risk. And to the extent that there's a risk, I do think Democrats are culpable for so poorly managing to defend trans rights.
No, I appreciate that. ContraPoints recently released a controversial statement about her thoughts on Israel-Palestine, why she doesn't comment on it as much. And one of the listed concerns related to a feeling of betrayal as, I don't know if these are actual quote, but it's something like her people are under attack, trans people are under attack, people like me are under attack. Do you feel that way, that you're under attack?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, maybe less acutely than many other trans people, but yeah.
Who's attacking you, Taf?
I think it's the right, for sure.
Did you vote for Kamala Harris?
I didn't, but I didn't vote for Trump either. So
Okay.
I'm just lazy, not
Amazing.
not actually a Trump voter.
Well, I'll give you the last word, but I do want to say everyone should check out your article. I linked it before. It's called "The Progressive Betrayal of Trans Americans." It's on Reason. Thank you very much, Cereal for Every Meal, for rating in. I appreciate you very much. But no, thank you so much for that part. I'm not done, but I just want to give you the last word on the And Cereal for Every Meal says, high rating because your guest is so cute. Carry on. Thank you very much, Cereal for Every
Wow.
Meal. But the last word on your article on trans rights, and then I have a couple other questions unrelated to the issue.
Last word. Yeah, the last word I would say is that although I think Democrats are culpable in some ways, I also don't think there has been a concerted or directed effort necessarily to engage in the bad kind of rhetoric that I have seen from the left. Rather, I think it's important to understand that a lot of the messaging arises from just like a series of bad incentives. So I think when progressives are talking to each other, they speak in ways which work for convincing and discussing internally, but don't work on the broader stage. And, you know, the language isn't working for trans people, but I think it has to do with Democrats maybe not like engaging with the broader political landscape as much as they should, rather than, them being malicious in some way.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that bone that you're throwing to the
Yeah, you're welcome,
disaffected
guys.
liberals and Democrats. Okay, but thank you so much about talking about that. What's going on? So how you doing? Are you taking a step away from doing these kind of political shows and stuff, or what's going on with you?
I don't know. I've been like so busy with my gay, wagey 4 hour
IRL.
life existence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where I just like work and I'm like exhausted and then I have like such little time for other stuff. So I'm like insanely impressed by people like you who manage to like have actual like lawyer work and then they get on and they argue for hours about politics.
Well, I stepped away from my
'Cause yeah.
firm like
Oh, really?
about a month ago, month and a half and change ago.
Oh, so it's
Yeah,
a
for
recent thing.
recent, very recent. Now I'm gonna probably take
Wait, okay, so how is
a
that?
pro bono case or two. It's good. There were several reasons for it, I think, that I talked about before. Part of them absolutely were lifestyle related because it really was my passion to like provide these kind of arguments and to look about what's going on and follow this litigation. And it's difficult to carry like a full caseload and do it at the same time, but also health related reasons. Like I wasn't getting outside as much, I wasn't walking as much. And now I'm back into my fitness routine. I'm back into like, actually, spending a little bit more time with the people I care about. So yeah, it's going well. And, channel's doing well. And I'm thinking about potentially taking a case or two, perhaps a pro bono one or two. I like the practice of being a lawyer. It was good. And, great experience that I received. But it feels like a little bit for me, like seeing what's going on in the country every day. It's like I'm in a bizarro world that our country has fallen so far. And so I feel a responsibility almost to do my part, however slight that is, to affect messaging potentially and like, think about the discourse and maybe I have some effect on some people. I don't want to pretend that I'm all this and all that. I'm, very small creator and that kind of thing. But yeah, no, it's going well in terms of all the other aspects.
Interesting. Is that scary? Like, financially?
No, not really. I mean, I'm do okay for myself. I do good. I did
Okay.
very well before my
Yeah.
practice, and so like I'm good. If I needed to get work,
You got the wiggle room.
yeah, I could get work if I wanted to get work. That's not really an issue. But it's more of in this moment, I think. It's what makes sense for me. And like I said, I might end up taking a case or two and stuff, but thankfully like the support has been great. Everyone's, supporting me and all that stuff. So yeah, it's going well. How's being what'd you say? Gay wagey?
Yeah, wage cuck, wage
Yeah.
slave,
Yeah.
not 4 hour life. I mean, it's hard. Like I feel like there's only so much time and motivation in the day. And I also have like exercise goals and personal goals to develop skills and to do all of these things. And it's like really hard to do that and to have the energy to do that at the end of a work day. And then also to be like, well, I'm going to do these sorts of talks as well. So I've tried to do like a few of these. And I think there's discussion with Brianna Wu that like we'll start doing something again. I have like a friend, a burgeoning friendship here in Texas with someone on his podcast, and I did a podcast with him on Saturday, and it was
Sick.
It was
What's
like
it
kind
called?
of rough.
Oh,
I
rough.
think it's called. Well, okay. I did one podcast with him a while back, and it went like really well. So he's like at this tiny YouTube channel. He's got like 100 subscribers or something. But my conversation with him got 3,000 views, which was like, he's before getting like 100 view on like a video. So it was like a huge explosion. I think that was really like satisfying and cool to see. It was a great conversation. He had me on again Saturday, and it was rough because like I had stayed up until like 4 a.m. the previous night, just like unable to fall asleep, not like intentionally staying up. So I get into the discussion and I'm like sort of out of it. I'm just a bad conversation partner. And there is this feeling of like, oh, like even trying to like do these things, like I am spreading myself thin. And, if it was, if I didn't have like a day job, I would love to do more stuff like this. But it is like hard to like, you bring up all this like, all these court cases, and I know like a little bit about them, right? Like, I know that the Supreme Court decided that there wasn't like that the sex distinction was not like important to the case. But I forget like the specific
the particular law that the law that was, I think this is a kind of wild opinion, but that was specifically targeted to trans people did not constitute sex discrimination. Notwithstanding the fact that in Bostock they had kind of said if it's a but-for cause. So your inclination there is correct. But the court did stop short of saying that trans people and sex minorities are not quasi-protected classes, which is like the big question. Even though Amy Coney Barrett signaled that you have at least 4 votes that say that they're not quasi-protected classes, the court did not officially reach that issue, and so it's still technically a live issue. Though I don't know if you would support them being protected by the Constitution, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
like a thorny legal question, but it's like one of these things that like deserves much more thinking than I could probably like give to it, especially than I can give to it in like a live conversation.
Given
your
responsibilities and all that stuff,
Yeah, so it is this like frustration where I'm like, oh, I wish I could like have more time to think about these issues deeply, but I just don't. And it's like important to like know my limitations so I'm not, speaking out of turn or saying dumb shit. 'Cause, God knows I've done plenty of that in my online career. But no, I do enjoy like talking about these things and writing about them and thinking about them. But yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd like to do more, but that's where my life is.
Who are you watching, or what are you watching these days?
Oh, I'm watching Love Island, USA. That's what
yeah.
I do. Yeah. Have you watched much
I've seen
of
it
that?
before, not by myself, of course, not by myself, but
Yeah, of course.
yeah, I would never watch that show. Yeah,
sitting down
come
and
on,
watching
with
that.
a mustache. Come on. But I like the music that they do before like every.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
It's so over the top, but it makes me laugh every time.
Yeah. My girlfriend has this thing that she'll say, because like we were watching one of these shows one time, and it like got this like really dramatic, somber tone. The piano music was coming in, and the lyrics were like, I just feel like a hamster in a wheel. And so like anytime the dramatic music comes in, she's like, a hamster in a wheel. And we burst out laughing. So it's good fun to make fun of.
It's a guilty watch.
Yeah, for sure.
Why
I also think it
do
might
you
be
like Peter Thiel? That guy's a weirdo. Stop listening.
think
What the fuck?
a Six Sigma intelligence
Dude, are you
predicted
serious?
the political landscape 20 years down the road.
He was asked like, do you believe in humanity? He's like, this guy's a freak. Why do you like him? What do you like about Peter Thiel? Oh, you're talking to him, aren't you? Yeah, you and Brianna Wu are being funded by Peter Thiel, aren't you? Polymarket Studio, right here. That's my reporting.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure.
I'm like, I know people that have like talked with him. Being here in Austin and like the tech scene, you get stories where people are like, oh yeah, I was talking to Peter Thiel, pitching him on my genomics startup, and he's just like staring at me in this, like leotard, and he's like, I can see his like bush or whatever.
Yo.
And I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy. So I'm like, I don't know, adjacent, but
Yeah.
not directly involved.
I'm busting your chops. Okay.
Yeah.
Last thoughts. First of all, thanks again for chilling as long as you did. What do you think about what's going on with the Trump administration beyond trans issues? What do you like from it, if anything? What do you dislike? What do you think about the Epstein stuff? Go for it.
I think it's been quite disappointing. I mean, I say that as someone who like
Did you have high hopes?
well,
What
even
the
like
fuck?
prior to the election, I was telling people like, yeah, I think you should vote for Kamala Harris. But even then, I was like, I think my thinking on Trump was like, he was a gamble. With Kamala Harris, we would get like stability and kind of more of the same, similar to like what we got under Biden.
All right, it's Kamala Harris.
Kamala. What am I saying?
Kamala.
Okay.
All right. No, sorry. I'm just being my woke scold. Sorry. Go ahead.
Miss Harris.
Yeah, Miss
Anyways,
Harris. I'm fucking with you.
I think you would have gotten more of the same. And with Trump, I was like, ooh, there's like a high risk of total disaster with him. But I also thought like, you know,
Aren't we seeing that?
what is that?
Isn't this a total disaster? The administration?
I think it's been pretty disastrous. Yeah. But I did think that like there was a chance, even if it was a small one, that like maybe he comes in and like he radically improves things, and the gray tribe is in control, and we've got people whispering in his ear, and he like makes a bunch of like pragmatic kind of like
You're quoting
wonky
Balaji?
decisions.
You're doing Balaji memes? What the f is this? Gray tribe? Holy shit! You're converted. You're a full on. You're one of these tealites. You're the enemy. The enemy's here.
I thought there was a chance, and it turns out that no, they were not in control, and he has not made great decisions. So even in my like, I don't think it's been like as disastrous as I thought it could be, but it's been on like the disastrous end of things.
Yeah. Have you signed up to Praxis?
What? No. What is Praxis? It sounds leftist.
Do you follow Mark Andreessen? Do you like Mark Andreessen?
Oh, yeah, he follows me on Twitter.
Oh, really?
So I think he follows me. Do I
Yeah.
follow him? And it's like, it's kind of a parasocial relationship, me and Mark.
Oh shit! Wow, would you look at that? You need to get away from these people. This is no good for you, Taf. These are bad boys. These are bad men.
You think so?
Yeah, not good. Not good. No bueno. No bueno. They want to destroy the country. They want to turn this into like tech fiefdoms. And you like that, don't you? You want to be in a tech fiefdom? Oh, you do? Holy shit. You want to be in a tech fief? Jesus.
I mean, is it voluntary? Do I have right to exit?
You want to destroy America. That's they were right about.
No, I love America, especially when it's splintered into 1,000 different fiefdoms run by Silicon Valley.
Holy
types.
shit. Holy shit.
It's even better. You get like 1,000 Americans. Have you ever? I'm fond of remarking that South Korean society is quite similar to North Korean society. It's just a series of North Koreas competing against each
I've
other.
never heard that.
And of course, I guess it's like kind of paraphrased from someone and kind of my own invention. But there's like a chaebol system in South Korea where you have these like almost like dynastic family firms, which it's incredibly prestigious to work for, and they will own like apartment blocks and employ people, and they have enormous control over people's lives. But it's much better to live in South Korea than North Korea, of course, because when you have a bunch of North Koreas competing against each other, they're forced to be at least a little bit humane. So
This is brainworm stuff. Don't listen to these people. These people will lead you astray. You need to embrace your inner lib. And you said that you had some lib leanings.
I do.
You're like
yeah.
Anakin Skywalker right now, and you're holding your lightsaber right next to Mace. I'm Mace, and you're about to cut my hand off. I'm trying to defeat the Emperor, and that's what you're doing right now. You're embracing tech feudalism.
Yeah.
That is.
Peter Thiel's like, do it.
Do it.
Strike him down.
Yeah, that's insane. I do think that's completely insane. It's one quick question. Are the meetings fun at least? Do you guys like have fun parties? What's the life like in? Are you in Texas right now? You don't have to say.
Yeah, I'm in Austin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where they're building stuff.
I mean, there was just like, it's a bunch of nerds, and nerds who are like, they love right wing philosophy and they love being involved in the administration, but they're also like, they like hang out with transsexuals and they like doing drugs. And yeah, I think it's a good time if you like that kind of style of libertarianish ethics where people are kind of high openness, but also, not exactly progressive.
Okay. How much do you love JD Vance on a scale of 1 to 10?
And I can't say 11. That's not allowed. I think his pronatalism is cool, but I don't know. I think he's too far on like the religious kind of like evangelical thing for me.
Okay. You haven't given me a number.
Oh, I don't know. 6.
6. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
It's decent.
Wouldn't lay my life down for him.
Okay.
But another person's life, maybe.
Who? Oh, so you would kill someone? You wouldn't kill yourself, but you'd kill people for JD Vance. That's great.
I would allow other people to die in his honor.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Ethan Klein or Hassan Piker?
Oh, Ethan Klein, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Best friends with Brianna Wood, could have predicted that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Israel or Palestine? You're like still pro-Israel?
Yeah, I would say like solidly. I mean, I'm less pro-Israel than Bree, but
she blocked me because I asked her, does she support the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, and she blocked me over that. I did put yes or no after, which again I acknowledge is a bit obnoxious of me to do, the whole yes or no memes, but she blocked me over that. So I think that's pretty crazy. Like my blocks are the following: I'm blocked by Brianna Wu, Cat Turd. Do you know Andy No? I'm blocked by him.
Yeah.
I'm blocked by Dave Rubin. I'm blocked by Destiny now. So I have like a rogues gallery now of people who've blocked me. And unfortunately your girl's on there, again, no ill will intended, but she has some cringe tweets. I just have to be honest with you. Some really cringe tweets.
Well, I'm sure whomst among us does not have cringe tweets, Pisco.
Very politically savvy. See, you're more politically savvy than you lead on. Okay.
What can I say?
Thank you so much for the conversation. I thought it was really, enlightening. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we talked about, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to shout yourself out, and basically, sign off.
Yeah, I think follow me on Twitter, Tafrisms. And yeah, I will continue to write and to shitpost and whatnot. But it was really good talking to you. I hope we do this again.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Taf. Great talking.
Yeah.
Peace out.
Bye, Pisco.
Bye-bye.